So I've been following an unsettling case as reported by the Daily Mail, and this was under the headline a few days ago of justice or torture. So it concerns a British national was born in London, Ye Ming Yuen. He's 21 now, and he's been living in Singapore since he was 17, but he was born in London. So this young man was charged with drug offences and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for drug trafficking charges. Um, Now, on the surface, that's not overly surprising. It's well known that Asian countries have a very hard line on drugs. Um, but the bit that I think would be disturbing to a lot of people is that on top of his sentence, he was sentenced to be flogged. Um, and I think a lot of people will question why that's necessary. Let me just make a few disclaimers before I continue with my thoughts on this. Um, I do agree with the principle that if you're in someone else's country, you abide by the laws, and if you break the laws, then you have to face consequences. Now, his own family has acknowledged that. There isn't a question here of his guilt, so it's not like he's been set up or something. He has pleaded guilty, and his family, who live in the UK, I'm just reading off the article here, said he accepted he had broken the law and deserved to be punished. This isn't a case of there's doubt about his guilt. He was guilty of these drug trafficking offences. I believe the drugs were cannabis and I can't recall, but he was guilty, and it was an incredibly foolish thing for him to do. Um, he came from a public school, the Westminster School, which has a fee of £41,000 a year. Um, This kind of reminds me of the film Rogue Trader with Ewan McGregor, although it's a different case. In that situation, Nick Leeson, who was famously a rogue trader, went to Singapore with some of his mates, and that's where he'd committed a lot of his crime actually. But they flashed their behinds at a nightclub, at a bar, and some young women complained, and they actually got off quite lightly, but I really, really think this case just should reiterate how careful um, people need to be in Asian countries, which are notoriously harsh when it comes to justice. Um, Now, I'm just going to say outright, I think this is barbaric. I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think Singapore can come up with any rational logic as to why the caning should be on top of the 20-year sentence. If it was caning on its own, or it was the sentence on its own, okay, you could say that's harsh, but that's their punishment. What I don't understand is why this young man is being caned on top of the sentence. It just seems unnecessarily cruel. A deterrent? I don't think so, because this sort of penalty has long been meted out in Singapore, yet you still get people who take risks and get into drug offences. So I don't think it's a deterrent. Um, he has pleaded guilty. He should be punished for what he's done. Before she became Home Secretary, Priti Patel said that, and again I'm quoting from the paper, it is astonishing to see these sorts of reprehensible punishments being given. This sounds like something from the Dark Ages. Um, the penalty in Britain for a similar offence would be a 12-month sentence. Now, one could argue, and I've often argued, that British justice is far often too lenient. I also see another extreme. I also think justice can be too severe. 20 years, as well as I believe it's 20 lashes. Apparently, according to this report, this has already been carried out. But this is something I find disturbing, and this is according to Parvis Jabbar of the Death Penalty Project, an international charity which helped with Yuen's legal case. His family has not been allowed any contact with him and were desperately worried. The British High Commission in Singapore is understood to have made an urgent request to see him in prison to check on his physical and psychological state. Um, this is a matter of concern because on a previous occasion, I believe it was 1995, a young American who had been charged with similar crimes was flogged, and after just the second lash, was said to have shouted out, "I'm dying," from the pain. People who think, "Oh, this is just a little like caning," they might sort of think of an old school, where you get a cane on the hand and it's painful. It's far worse than that. This is, I understand, a 6 foot kind of raw cane. It's quite thick, and in order to keep up the intensity of it, the loads emitting are actually switch places so that they don't get so that the intensity is of the same level with each stroke. Now, in my opinion, that doesn't belong in the 21st century. And Singapore might say, "Oh well, we're only taking it from the British colonial era because these are the sort of punishments that went on in the days of the British Empire." But Singapore is a modern, wealthy, in many ways developed country. So I do not see any reason, rationale, how this can be condoned. If you're Singaporean and you're saying, "Oh, your national broke our laws," read my lips. He should be punished. He should be punished. What I am saying is that goes too far. And by the way, if such a thing was going on in this country, I would be saying we needed to reform it. We needed to get rid of it immediately. As far as I'm concerned, no laws are more important than human rights. None. And I don't care if it isn't popular to say that. That's my gut, honest feeling. At the very least, they should allow access to the High Commissioner, or at least his or her representatives, to say that he is um, in in a reasonable, humane condition. I.e., if the sentence has already been carried out, he's already been flogged. At least see if the wounds have been treated, for example. Because that could get infected. There's all sorts of question marks around that. Um, People might say, even some Britons will condone it. They'll say, "Oh well, you should have known better. He was an idiot. I have no sympathy with him." Well, I have old-fashioned compassion. I think that he was foolish, very foolish. By the way, I don't trivialize drugs. Drugs ruin lives, and if you traffic drugs in an Asian country, you're asking for trouble. It's one of the dumbest things you can do. But it's not just stupid, it's also morally wrong. Drugs can ruin young lives. Drugs are a poison on this world. I hate the sort of drugs that, were used just for, not for medical reasons, but for recreational, habitual behavior. And, you see the effects that drugs have. So I'm not questioning why they take a hard line on drugs. That's not what I'm questioning. But what I'm questioning is why the flogging on top of the sentence. It makes no sense to me. It really, I cannot, I cannot reconcile why the two need to go together. If it was one or the other, I mean, if it was a flogging on its own, I'd say, okay, well, that was pretty harsh. I'd still say that doesn't belong in the modern era. But on top of the prison sentence, you can imagine, what he's going through. And remember, he's only 21. So really, Singapore, this also gets into an issue of Asian values. The late Lee Kuan Yew was a well-known proponent of so-called Asian values. But the thing with Asian values, it was kind of set up in the 90s. I believe it was a Bangkok conference of 1993, supposedly as an alternative to Western values. And it was supposed to talk about the unique standards of the Asian people as if that is one homogenous thing. Asia is a huge continent. But this is misleading. The sort of values that the West has are not unique to the West. Democratic values, human rights values for that matter, because you have other prominent Asian leaders who reject this idea of Asian values. An example is the former South Korean president, uh, Kim Dae-jung. He had spoken out against this idea that Asian values represent all Asians. I personally think that Asian values are an excuse by autocratic leaders and regimes to impose their will. Singapore remains quite an autocratic state. I wouldn't say it's a full on dictatorship, but it is quite autocratic. And I remember a Singaporean friend of mine once asked what my perception of Singapore was. And I replied to her honestly. I said, well, it looks like a beautiful country. It's obviously very wealthy, very clean, but I do have questions about its attitude to human rights. And she responded, well, surely the need to live in safety is one of the most important human rights, and I totally agree. But I do take the view that it doesn't matter how clean your streets are, if there are basic infractions of basic human rights standards going on, then that's nothing to boast about. So Singapore often, holds itself up to be this very progressive society, but is it? I mean, is it the best place in the world for human liberty? Far from it. Far from it. I'm not saying it's the worst, but some people might say, oh, well, this is an example of Western arrogance, British guy sticking his nose in. Well, I'm interested because this is a compatriot, right? That's the first point. And the second point is I just I just don't think it's necessary. And I'm, by the way, making this video from my country. So it's not like I'm making this in Singapore and sort of being an outsider interfering. I'm making this in my country. I reserve the right to say anything I want, short of issuing threats or short of slander or anything like that. Um, but so long as we have freedom of expression in this country, I'm not going to self-censor on these things. I'm not going to equivocate. If you disagree with what I'm saying, okay, but I would challenge you, if you support this, explain to me why you think that the flogging on top of the prison sentence is necessary. Why not just the prison sentence? He's still being punished for what he's done. I mean, I know the Home Office is trying to get maybe an extradition for him to serve the remaining time in a British prison. What often happens with foreigners is they don't serve the full sentence abroad. I mean, I know in Thailand when foreigners have been accused of lèse majesté, the notoriously harsh um, penalties for perceived insult to monarchy, what's usually happened is the king has granted them a royal pardon, and they've got a much lower sentence than a Thai would. But like I say, I respect sovereignty. I respect the idea, the principle that countries have their own laws and people should abide by those laws. So if you're doing drugs in Singapore, you know it has tough penalties. I mean, this was an educated young man. I can't believe that he was totally ignorant of that. So what he done was, incredibly foolish. Um, but I don't think that condones the sort of treatment. Is it torture? I think it's borderline. I think it's borderline, given the sort of pain that it inflicts, given the sort of degrading treatment. Because, by the way, the person is subjected to indecency. They're totally stripped naked. So there's contradiction in this. I mean, Singapore has morality laws. For example, I mentioned that case of Nick Leeson was charged when they showed their bare behinds, but they don't care about, I mean, the logic of this, there's no care for the the condemned when they're stripped naked. I think that's barbaric. I think it's barbaric, and I don't think Singapore should be doing this in the 21st century. Um, but that's the way it is, and I just hope that at this point, if the sentence has already been carried out, I think they should at least give reassurance to the British authorities that he hasn't suffered severe blood loss or something like that. He hasn't passed out, and whatever injuries he has had, they need to grant a visit. I think that is a reasonable request. It's not demanding that he's released. It's just asking for a visit to check on his welfare. And by the way, I would say the same thing about if foreign nationals were held in British jails and their embassy wanted to know their state. I would say we need to be transparent. We need to show that they are being treated in a humane way. So I hold the same standards to my country. But I do not accept this thing of, well, different countries have different laws, so we can just do whatever we like. I believe human rights are more important than any law. Any law. That's why I'm equally vocal about blasphemy laws that persecute minorities. and Thailand's absurd and brutal lèse-majesté laws. I was going to make a video specifically on that, and I may still do so because there's been more protests demanding reforms there. But I just don't see any justification for this. Now that they have given him the flogging, um, I think at the very least they need to allow a visit. It's just cruel not allowing him any contact with his family, not allowing the British High Commissioner to pay a visit or his staff to pay a visit, you know. And if you're going to defend this, then I would like to see what your argument is. I'm not talking about final point. I've said this a few times, but I'll say it once again, just to, you know, in case anyone's in any doubt. I am not saying that he shouldn't be punished. He should be punished. It would be a travesty if he wasn't punished. If he committed a crime in another country and he was let off the hook. That isn't the case. He's been given a very long custodial sentence, which, by the way, many murderers get less than that in this country. So I think that's has a lot of question marks. It's possible that he'll get extradited at some point after serving a number of years. If that happens, then I just hope it's also a warning to anyone who's foolish enough to do this in the Far East. If you're a tourist, a teacher, whatever the case might be, a business person, just look at this, look at what happens. For God's sake, don't be foolish because the British embassy, the British consulate can only do so much. We cannot just dictate to another country, and that's the difficulty. You need to be aware of that. I think some Westerners maybe go and think, oh, well, London will defend me. No, there's limits on what they can do. When I went to China, we were all warned, do not do drugs because your embassies cannot help you. The company cannot help you. Just don't do it. Having said that, I think it is right that the Foreign Office has criticised this decision. I don't agree with this idea that we should just keep our mouth shut because it's another country. It is the responsibility of the Foreign Office to speak up for British citizens in trouble abroad. That is one of the responsibilities. So I think it's right that we have condemned this decision. It's barbaric. Stripping someone naked and flogging them. Um, yes, his offence is serious. It's a drug offence. Drugs ruin lives. So jail him. Why the flogging?